go. So let's get started. Welcome. Hi, everyone. I think I've met most of you in the room, but if I haven't yet, my name is Ashley Walters. I'm a professor here in the Jewish Studies program. I also direct the Perlstein-Lipoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture, and we are one of the hosts of tonight's event. So thank you so much for being here. I will introduce our guest in just a moment, but before I do want to thank our co-sponsors. We had a lot of interest in participating in this event tonight, so we have Hispanic studies to thank, as well as Latin American and Caribbean studies, religious studies, and of course the Center for Southern Jewish Culture. So with that being said, I do want to share that we have some upcoming events in Jewish studies that I'd like to tell you a little bit about. On Monday, October 24th at 6 p.m., Charleston Jewish Film Fest will be hosting Berenstein, which tells the story of Lanny Berenstein, the commander of a partisan battalion in World War II, who located the secret facility where the Nazis were developing their wonder weapon. And this event is also hosted by the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies, and the director of that center, Professor Chad Gibbs, will be leading a conversation after the event. If you haven't had enough of us yet, the following day you can come back for another event. This will be at 1 p.m. and it is exploring the American progressive movement and Israel, and it will be a conversation with the goal of gaining a better, nuanced understanding of the ideas that shape this potent political discourse and what it means for engagement and around Israel and/or anti-Semitism. And then finally, we have our next Sunday brunch, which are postponed. So we
November
will end that there. Okay, it's going to be an exciting one when we finally get there. So we'll stop there, but we hope to see you at those events. So the plan for tonight is I will begin the conversation with Dr. Rosenblatt with a handful of questions, and as you can see, he has a wonderful slideshow here ready for us. Then we will open up the conversation to the audience so you can ask your questions. If you're in the room, you simply need to raise your hands. If you're on Zoom, you can type your question into the chat box, and we will read it aloud for Dr. Rosenblatt. Our goal is to try and get through as many questions by 8 p.m. Okay. All right, so now I get to introduce you. We're almost there. Dr. Eli Rosenblatt is the Wallerstein Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. His research interests include modern Yiddish literature, United States and Caribbean Jewish cultures, and modern Jewish thought. He's currently at work on 2 projects, one about Ashkenazic Jews and racial politics in the Atlantic world, and the other a collection of scholarly essays on the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois in light of contemporary Jewish concerns. And I have to say, I'm really excited about Eli's work. I think those of us working on modern Jewish history really appreciate how crucial this new scholarship is to rethinking the modern Jewish experience through the prism of the Atlantic world, especially in our understandings of the interaction of race and religion in the Americas. So I'm thrilled to learn more about your work, and I'm thrilled that you're here to join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Walters. I want to thank you and the College of Charleston, the Jewish Studies program, and everyone that had a stake in me coming here tonight. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to share some of this work with you. Can everybody hear me? Is everybody good? Okay. So I think I'm just going to go through some slides, do some sort of introductory or maybe more than introductory speaking about the subject matter, and then we can open it up to questions. You can use the questions that we discussed before as a guide. But this is to give you a sense of sort of 1/4 of my book project, which is about Suriname. And I'm just a show of hands. Has anybody ever heard of Suriname before or know about Suriname? Great, excellent. I'm in the right place, Charleston, South Carolina, as you probably will see. So the title of this talk is Creole Israel, Abraham Philip Samson and the Formation of a Caribbean Jewish Rootsman. The basis of this talk is an archive that exists in the Netherlands in the Jewish Cultural Quarter as sort of part of the Jewish Community Archives by a man named Philip Abraham Samson. And he was an avid collector. He was a Surinamese-born Jewish collector of local Judaica and basically Jewish materials of all kinds in the early and mid 20th century. And his father was Abraham Philip Samson. This was a naming convention in Suriname and elsewhere. And Abraham Philip Samson, rather than Philip Abraham Samson, his son, became the focus of this project because I realized over time that it was Abraham Philip Samson, the father, who had really a larger stake in giving substance and meaning to the materials that his son collected. But before we begin, I just want to share, is this the clicker? Yeah. Okay. So before we begin, I just want to show you images of this archive, a Jewish community newsletter from Suriname in the early part of the 20th century. Now, if you don't know much about Suriname, here it's a small country on the northeastern coast of South America, and you can't see the image actually. I'm not sure if that's a projection thing or it's a something else, but in any case, it's on the northeastern coast of South America, at basically the other extreme end of the Caribbean cultures. It's between French Guiana and Guyana, formerly British Guyana. It was Dutch Guyana. So it was a Netherlands colony. And it was settled in the mid-1600s by Europeans, many of which were Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the descendants of those who had been exiled from the Inquisition, something that the city of Charleston also shares in this history. So as we explore the country of Suriname, I think that you'll probably see many resonances with the history and culture of this country, as well as some major differences. One thing that's very important to note about Suriname, and one of the reasons that it's so significant in modern Jewish history, at least according to me, is that the European population in the most powerful, economically powerful, and culturally rich part of the colony's history was 1/3 to 1/2 Jewish. So the population of the European population was very, very influenced by Jewish culture, Spanish, Portuguese Jewish culture especially. But 90% of the colony's population was of African descent and enslaved. So you could say that 10% of the population was white, was European, and the other 90% was, for the most part, African, with other ethnic groups slowly being added to the mix. Most of the recent scholarship that's been sort of worked on and disseminated on the country of Suriname, on the colony of Suriname, is from the era of slavery, which was about 1640 to 1863. And you see on this map on the left, in larger letters, it says Judsdorp and Synagogue, and then it says, it has a bunch of different interior plantations around this Jewish village and synagogue. The plantation of Baruch da Costa, Avram de Pina, Yosef Nasi, and even Gerrit Jacobs, who came to this colony from Lithuania to establish a plantation. A fascinating sort of side narrative in the history of Jews in Suriname in the era of slavery. But what's also important to note at this time in the era of slavery is the continued resistance of enslaved Africans against their bondage and the development over time of large communities of Maroons, that is, self-emancipated people who fled into the interior of the country and would return periodically to the plantations of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews to pillage and attack. And so you have one of the earliest examples of original Hebrew liturgy in the Americas is actually a prayer asking God for protection from these Maroon attacks. So you have a very interesting sort of first, or one of the firsts, one of the first original Hebrew liturgies to be recited in a synagogue in the Atlantic world was catalyzed by the experience of Jewish dwellers on plantations, that is the plantocracy, and their fear of Maroon revolt. Now, we're going to fast forward to the period of time in Samson's archive that I'm really working with. And that's the period of Surinamese Jewish history after the abolition of slavery in 1863. Now, one of the things that differentiates Suriname from the United States is that the Dutch forbid enslaved people to convert to Christianity. They were very fearful of Christian missionaries in the early years of colonization because they felt that Christian missionaries from Europe, white missionaries, would impart human dignity on the enslaved and undermine the system. A difference from the United States, but a very important difference. Now, you have to understand, I said in the beginning that the Jewish population, the European population, was largely Jewish in the era of slavery in the colony of Suriname. And this meant that the first European or non-African religious system to be exposed to enslaved people was Judaism. And many enslaved people on the plantations owned by Jews didn't become Jews themselves, although a small number did convert, but were just exposed to Jewish culture. Were exposed to the Sabbath, were exposed to dietary laws, and so forth. Christian missionaries start to arrive in Suriname after the abolition of slavery, or a little bit before the abolition of slavery, because the Dutch felt that then Christianity was necessary for organizing a society of people who had been emancipated from slavery. And so you have in the colony after, say, 1840, or even 1800, but intensifying in 1840 about the arrival of Moravian Christian missionaries, Herrnhuters, evangelical brethren, who come from Bohemia, are radical Protestant Christians, and they come to the colonies in order to missionize and spread the gospel among people who are either ending their lives as slaves and becoming free, or who are free already. Now, this adds an element of Jewish-Christian antagonism in the colony that shapes Jewish life after the emancipation of enslaved people. And that really is sort of the crux of my research questions. I'm interested in how, after the era of slavery in Suriname, Jewish people experienced the Christianization of a society that had heretofore been a place of both very deep African subjugation and very free and autonomous Jewish life based on that very system. So what happens when Christianity arrives in a Jewish world in a way, but arrives as a liberating force, arrives as a force that's meant, at least in the eyes of the missionaries, to correct the society's ills? Although many of these missionaries themselves had owned slaves, they were, you could say, spiritually and ideologically against the institution and started to describe it as Jewish. This is an interesting kind of thing. Now, what's very important about this image is a Belgian painter, a very notable Belgian painter, went to Suriname and made famous sketches that you can see in the Netherlands today. And this is the caption that he made for this image. And it says, 5 female slaves on their way to their church on a holiday. On the right, a Lutheran, next to a Jewess, a Calvinist, and a Moravian. In the background, a young Christian Creole slave going to church on Palm Sunday. So second from the right is the Jewish woman. You can see from how she looks, her hair is exposed, Her back is exposed, her shoulder blades are exposed. In a way, this Christian painter is portraying the sensuality and the carnality of the Jews. It's very important here, I think, to understand that at this point in Surinamese Jewish history, most sort of members of the Jewish community, or most people who are affiliated culturally with the Jewish community, are themselves becoming more and more people of at least partial African descent. So I painted a picture in the era of slavery of European Jews and African enslaved people. But what I'm adding to the mix now is that in the era of slavery and thereafter, the Jewish community itself becomes progressively more dark-skinned because of the nature of the society, you can say. And in the beginning, of course, and continuing through the 19th century, the sexual violence that's endemic to the society, based on, of course, the system of slavery. Now, another important shift that I look at is the advent of the Ashkenazic community. So as slavery declines, the Sephardic community becomes poorer and poorer. The economic basis of the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic community is undermined by the end of slavery. And they're replaced in a way by a mercantile class of Ashkenazic Jews who arrive in Paramaribo and build the synagogue that you see here today that's still standing. And this was a synagogue built by enslaved people. Yep, oh, yeah, I don't think I have the power to do it, but it was built in 1842, that building, but the Ashkenazic community was established in some way in 1735. And you can see actually at the American Jewish Archives the register of enslaved people that were hired basically from other people to build the synagogue. This is a picture of Jews Broadway. If your back is to the synagogue that you just saw and you're looking down the street, that is the main drag of the Jewish neighborhood of Paramaribo, Suriname. And it's really a gem of Dutch colonial architecture at this time. One thing that Samson collects in his archives are records of the Jewish community's rabbinic figures. And this is the first rabbinic figure in the aftermath of slavery. He only lasted, I think, a few years because he died of malaria upon coming to Paramaribo. But he was, in a sense, a colonial rabbi. He was installed by the Beit Din of Amsterdam to unite the Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities. As you know from Charleston and elsewhere, it is very rare for a synagogue to describe itself as Ashkenazic and Sephardic, like exceedingly, exceedingly rare. In Suriname, because of the nature of the society's decline and the economic weakness of the Sephardic community, there was this sense that the colonial power could coalesce the two communities under one rabbi. This, of course, did not happen. But it's an interesting moment in modern Jewish history when the colonial manifestations of modern orthodoxy, you could say, on the Hildesheimer model is transported from the Netherlands to the Atlantic world. And these are just two other things in the archive, basically a program for emancipation of enslaved people and a choral program. And then just a photo of immigrants arriving in Paramaribo. These are all from the archives in the Netherlands. What's that? The capital of Suriname is Paramaribo, yes. So these are some photographs from the archive, from the Samson archive. Just two members of the Jewish community at a festive meal of a couple in the 30s in Suriname. And just the arrow on the right points to one of the descendants of Abraham Philip Samson, Marcus Samson, his son. And there he is as a young man. He's going to come back into the presentation. Just a picture for illustration that the vast majority of Paramaribo's inhabitants are people of African descent. and the descendants of people who were enslaved on the plantations and came to the city over the course of the 19th century. Also, the British brought in indentured labor from India, as they did in Trinidad and Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean. So this was also part of the Samson archive, is documenting the arrival of people from India coming very recently to the colony, as well as pictures of the Maroons. The Maroons, as I gestured before, were responsible in the early part of the colony's history for establishing autonomous, self-emancipated communities in the interior of the country. And they developed their own governmental structure that then comes to the capital and negotiates with the colonial powers for dry goods, foodstuffs, and so forth. This is a picture of you could say, chiefs of the various Maroon clans in the 1910s in Paramaribo. These would be, in a sense, the descendants of those who were enslaved, at least in part, on plantations owned by Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Now, an important part of the archive is about anti-Semitism. When I mentioned the Christianization of the country by Moravian missionaries, I want us to keep in mind that these missionaries were German-speaking missionaries with some experience failing among the Jews. So they don't come to Suriname with no history. A lot of the Moravian missionaries have a very, very well articulated sense of what the Jew symbolizes in their theologies. And they use this figure, this Jewish figure, in a country with real, actual Jews to create a Christian society, to structure a society around Christianity that responds to the experiences of people who have not yet been saved, you could say. Now, one of the ways the Christian missionaries functioned in the colony was by getting close to various colonial authorities, because it was the colonial authorities in the Netherlands that ultimately gave them permission to operate in Suriname and to work in Suriname. And so one particular governor, Lohman, 1889 to 1891, published in the Netherlands polemics against the Talmud. He was a seasoned sort of anti-Semitic figure in the Netherlands. And when he was appointed colonial governor, the Jewish community in Suriname was well aware of his views, and was also well aware that he was ideologically committed to the liberation in a Christian sense of people who had been emancipated. So he was appointed governor in part because he worked very well with the missionary institutions that were giving a political structure and a cultural structure to a colony that, of course, perceived by the colonial authorities had no culture, was primitive and unable to rule itself. So there was an alliance between Lohman and the Moravian missionaries. Now, one of the complicated political issues, of course, was that the local government in Paramaribo had maybe 13 or 14 members, and they were basically a Congress that represented the colony to the Netherlands, to the colonial authorities. The majority of those members of the colonial states were Jewish, were the descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, many of them people of color, but were still part of the perceived Jewish cultural and political domination in the colony. So I found in a very interesting Moravian newspaper that was published in both the Netherlands and the colony, articles that were basically campaigning against the Jewish presence in the colony. And you see, it will be a great pity for us if you have to give the Israelites of Suriname strength and power to take on all our Black people's affairs in Para and to look after our interests. Then we are completely possessed in the bonds of the devil, for the devils are related to the Jews. Papa, dear Papa, that's the governor, we are the Black people of Para. Help us out of this distress which the Jews have placed upon us. So I found this in an 1891 newspaper, and after these series of editorials were published, there was an attack on Jewish property during a gathering and a protest in Paramaribo. No one was killed, but in the archives, in the Samson archives, there's an indication that the protesters who were protesting taxation by that colonial Congress were targeting Jewish property. But again, this is not so simple, because we're talking about a colony whose economic basis in the time of slavery was deeply affected by the presence of Spanish and Portuguese Jews involved in the slave trade. So this is not just, looking for the right side. This is an extremely complex political conundrum that exists in Suriname. Here's a picture of those colonial states with many different members who are members of the Jewish community. Here's a picture of the missionaries in 1885, and you can see at top I cut out you can see the missionaries behind. You can see the missionaries behind the people, and then you can see one of the children of the missionaries. But this is really, even to this day, in a lot of parts of the Caribbean, one of the major Christian streams. So this is simply just part of the greater cultural heritage of the Caribbean. And here's just a picture of a gathering. I believe this is upon the arrival of a Netherlands representative to the colony. The women in kotomisi, the traditional Surinamese dress based on Afro-Creole traditions. Here's a picture of the Fernandez family in the early 1900s. This is a famous photograph of a Spanish-Portuguese Jewish family. And you can see, of course, that by the early 1900s, many members of the Jewish community, even as they're suffering sort of, you could say, Christian anti-Semitism, reflect in a physical sense the appearance of everyone else in the colony. So it's not simply about color, it's very complicated, complex array of identifications. I'm going to skip this because that doesn't make sense right now. But in the archive, Samson talks a lot about the African elements in Jewish culture in Suriname. So all types of Jewish forms are given in some sense Vinti, which is the sort of Afro-Creole religious tradition in Suriname, related, of course, to Haitian Vodun and Cuban Santeria and so forth. Mezuzahs are widespread in Suriname, mostly to protect the door, which is a locus of vulnerability in Afro-Creole homes. They have mourning periods that are clearly influenced by the era of slavery. And Sukkot in Suriname is considered a kind of ecumenical holiday in which food that's served in the cabana, the sukkah, is distributed to everyone, as well as food taboos that have very little resemblance to kashrut, to Jewish dietary laws, but are called kasiri and trefu, which derive from the Hebrew terms from kosher laws. That is, those are the words in Sranan Tongo, the language spoken in Suriname. This is the much smaller and more modest synagogue of the Portuguese Israelites. I took this photograph. This synagogue's interior is at the Israel Museum. So if you're in Israel and you go to the Israel Museum, you can see the interior of the synagogue in Israel. Just some more pictures of Jews Broadway in 1922. A picture again of the synagogue and just some more houses. You can see, of course, in the architecture of this city how much it shares with all the various points in the Atlantic world. This is not a place, it looks very different, you could say, if you've ever been to Brazil. It looks very different. It looks much more like New England than it does look like the rest of South America. Here's a picture of the Ashkenazic synagogue in the 1920s, and the arrow is on Philip Abraham Samson, and Abraham Philip Samson is sitting second from the left. That's his father. They were pillars of the Jewish community, and the synagogue was always very proudly adorned with local flowers. This was the pride of the synagogue, was the flowers that grew in Suriname were, even today, the synagogue is taken over with flowers. And there's Marcus Samson, Abraham Philip Samson's son, Philip Abraham Samson's brother. And there is Marcus Abraham Samson in 1904. He was born in 1904, and they moved to the Netherlands. So a very important aspect of this community's history is that a large portion of the young left and went to the Netherlands. Largely based, it seems, in a lot of the scholarship, based on that 1891 moment of tension in the colony with the colonial governor. The Jewish community it declined after the disturbances of 1891, and the children that were born after that, with the larger economic decline of the colony, a lot of them moved to the so-called mother country. But what's important to see here is that both of these people were born in Paramaribo. And that's them in their pharmacy in the Netherlands. They were pharmacists. It's a family of pharmacists. So Abraham Philip Samson was a pharmacist, and Marcus was also. And then this is another picture of an Ashkenazic Jewish community, or Ashkenazic Jewish family, the Samuels. And I'll speed up a little bit, but you can see here from this evocative photograph, of course, the social and racial dynamics of the colony, even into the 1900s. Of course, still part of the colony. Note Hannah Samuels. She marries one of Abraham Philip Samson's sons, Philip Abraham, and this is again with the flowers on their wedding day in 1928. The Jews of Suriname were instrumental in the educational system. So you see other members of the Samson family with their classes. And by the early 20th century, you can see just the diversity of the colony, with indentured laborers having been brought, the Chinese, European, Javanese, Afro-Creole, and so forth. I just love the pictures of the children. It's really evocative. Just more photographs. And this is a vocational school with another member of the Samson family. These are nurses. Second from the right, the notation says Jewess. This is supposed to be, I think, a kind of ethnic tableau. Another picture. This is Richel Samson in her classroom in Paramaribo. More pictures of the Jewish newspaper. These are Nazis that were deported to Suriname from the Netherlands East Indies, and they were deported to Joden Savannah, which was the site of the synagogue around the plantations, a kind of irony there. And then this is clearing of that cemetery during World War II. The United States Army occupied Suriname in the World War II because they produced aluminum for the Allied war effort. Bauxite, which is produced in a lot of Caribbean countries, was produced also in Suriname. So they were afraid that the Germans were going to attack the bauxite mines. And that's pictures of soldiers on the ruins of the synagogue at Joden Savannah. Just more pictures from the bulletin. You see that the ads are in the Creole. Says, "Countryman, don't make a mistake. Amstel beer you must buy." There's poetry. It's a very sort of just deeply expressive community. There's, if anybody wants recipes, get at me after. There's recipes from Paramaribo, especially for Pesach. It's not a bread culture, so they have amazing Pesach recipes. Just some more images, bar mitzvahs, and so forth. This is the street that that the journal is published on, and you can see that it's printed in the 50s by an Islamic publisher. This has to do with the bifurcation of Surinamese politics between the Afro-Creole, the black political parties, and the Indian political parties. The Jews in this particular political context were more politically aligned with the Indian community against the black politics. Some more poetry. There was a Zionist union, and one of the rare pictures of women in the journal is when they talk about Zionism. that women were active in the Zionist movement in Suriname. And this has to do, in some ways, the rise of Zionism has to do with the increasing antagonism towards Jews or just European associated influence in the anti-colonial context of Suriname. Herzl shows up. And then I'll just conclude by saying that this is a history that is located in a sort of very specific geographic place with a very specific history. But the fact is that many Surinamese Jewish people moved to the Netherlands in the early 20th century. And Marcus Samson and his wife and his 2 kids all perished at Auschwitz. And I always wonder to myself, I know this is a grotesque image, but I wonder to myself, 2 people sitting next to Marcus Samson on each side at a concentration camp, look at him and must have been completely mystified. Because he's like, I'm Jewish, I'm here because they rounded up the Jews of Amsterdam, and is clearly a man of African descent. It's a very interesting sort of evocative image of the ways in which Surinamese Jewish history and culture can sort of speak to different constituencies. World War II was a turning point in the community's life and demoralized. So many people lost their children and their relatives that you can see here the synagogue in sort of a state of disarray in 1948. And Abraham Philip Samson dies in 1959. And that's his photograph in his old age. And there was a remembrance published. This is one of the last issues of the journal in 1959. And there's his son, Philip A. Samson, in the Netherlands in the 1960s. And there's a photograph I took of Jews Broadway in 2018. With you can't see it in the image, but that hotel on the left with the blue wall is called the Hotel Krasnopolski, because there was a Polish Jewish family that came at some point and established that hotel on Jews Broadway. And just some more photographs. Yeah, I recommend visiting because it's from if you ever go to Aruba or Curacao, it's very easy to get to Suriname. So I like to say to everyone that if you find yourself vacationing in those very popular vacation spots, you have some of the easiest access you'll have to Suriname from those Dutch possessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question about the Rootsman.
Yeah.
He's an apothecary.
Yes, yes.
And the Rootmen were like in Romeo and Juliet, with father who concocted things.
Right.
Is that
The metaphor for me most immediately comes from, he was talking about what he wanted to understand the Rootsman in the title, how that factors into Abraham Philip Samson. That in a part comes from reggae music for me. It's the idea that a person becomes culturally conscious based on some kind of ephemeral idea of their ancestry and their past. And you see in the Samson family a great ambivalence about their history. They know that they descend from both the plantocracy and the majority of the colony of African descent. And there was over time in the Samson archive a clear indication that for some reason or another, their cultural allegiances and their political allegiances were with the Jews in this particular time. And this is in a community where people's sense of Jewish identity is not as located around the health of institutions as in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere. It's a place where there's a lot of people who are sort of on the edges of the Jewish community, people who might have never been to synagogue, but have a sense of, you've probably heard this idea, my family lit candles on Friday night, we didn't know why. This kind of Jewishness is very common in Suriname. And this particular family, for some reason, was very strongly identified with being Jewish. And I think that in some ways is indicative of that ethos in the 20th century Caribbean of having to make your identity out of very ambivalent strands. And that's my answer.
I look at the Caribbean and I say sedition in the South.
Mm-hmm.
English, Spanish, Dutch, French. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Haiti rebel against their own,
Yeah,
and they bring in more root doctrine.
sure.
So I see the connection.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alexander Hamilton was from Yevis,
Mhm.
sedition.
So we have a question in the back?
Sure.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm curious about the word maroon.
Yeah.
Was that their self-identification, or was that put on them? Where did the word come from?
My sense is that it's, at least in Suriname, it's almost not, maybe not necessarily, it's a commonly used term that's used instead of pejorative terms. So like, if you, in the early 20th century, you'd hear stuff like to describe a person who was self-emancipated. I think the most proper way to describe a person in Suriname that identifies with the ethnicity of Maroon is a person whose ancestors were self-emancipated. In the ethnic nomenclature of Suriname, that's the preferred term against, I'll say it, it's an offensive term, bush Negro. In the early 20th century, that was basically the most commonly used term for a person who descended from the emancipated. That was based on a spurious notion of their primitive nature. It was sort of, I think that Maroon comes from a French root, some part of the French Caribbean, but I'll have to check for you.
Very interesting, thank you. I have two questions.
Sure.
One, how did the Jews become darker and darker? Was it taken with female slaves, and then how do they stay Jewish because the mother is not Jewish? And then my second question is, I know in Jamaica there's many Jamaicans are very fond of Israel, which you don't see a lot of that in these days, unfortunately, and follow some Jewish traditions. Was there something similar in Jamaica or the entire Caribbean with Jews?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the second question was, is Jamaica an analogous situation in some ways? That's the first question. Yes, there are many differences, of course, between every site in the Caribbean in terms of the Jewish community and the colony itself, but the same general outline is there. Spanish and Portuguese Jewish settlement and involvement, at least on some level, of Jews in the practice of slavery, like all European residents of those colonies, or at least a lot of European residents of those colonies. The Jews, I believe, though, in Jamaica descend from different communities in Europe. So Bordeaux, for example, fed into Jamaica. The other question you have about, how did the Jewish community become progressively darker? That is the area of scholarship that has been most spun out and we know more and more about. So you're absolutely correct in saying number one reason that the Jewish community becomes darker complected is because of the sexual violence endemic to the slave system. So you have Jewish fathers and enslaved African mothers, and there are many offspring of that violence. And a small portion of those children are converted to Judaism. It was contingent on the attitude of the father. Some fathers had a particular feeling that they felt that their children should be members of the Jewish community. But what happened over time is that the Jewish community developed a class system based on race that upheld the racial divisions of the colony. So the synagogue itself had levels of membership. So people of African descent had to sit in a certain place in the synagogue, or various things. Even people, Jewish people of color, even established their own religious fraternity in the early 1800s, I believe, based on that second-class status that was imposed upon them in the early synagogues in the era of slavery and thereafter. But the fact is that over time, like all people in Caribbean societies, people get mixed up. This is like not necessarily a Jewish story. It's just a story of any country, even the United States. So that said, the other aspect of this, I think that's important, is that so many children were born out of that era who had no relationship to the Jewish community, but whose mothers were enslaved by Jewish people and therefore felt in some way or another an affiliation, at least, with Jewish identity. And that created in Suriname this idea that Jewishness was a constituent element in Creole culture. That fed into an idea that was introduced by Moravian missionaries that people of African descent who had been emancipated and accepted Jesus as their savior were performing Jewishness in a more authentic way than the Jews that had been the slavers. So there's a lot of interesting mixture of theology, politics, racial politics, and so forth. It's, yeah, go ahead.
I have another question, and that is the photograph that you had at the beginning of the slide of the woman in white wedding dress and the white wedding gown and her husband, or
Yeah, it was her husband.
yeah. And so, how common was that, and was it accepted there when it wasn't? It would take decades before it would be accepted here in the United States.
You know, my sense from Suriname in that era, especially in the Jewish community, was that the person pictured was a man named Moses Teitelbaum, and he was an Ashkenazic Jew, I believe, of Polish background, whose family came in the middle of the 19th century, so the 1860s or the 1870s. And that kind of union where you would marry a local woman was very, to my knowledge, at least in the archives, as you see it in the ketubos, in the marriage contracts, it's sometimes noted the woman's surname before marriage, and it's often an Afro-Creole name with no indication of Jewishness. Halachic Jewishness, that is, Jewishness determined according to Jewish law. And so I can't say that it was, accepted or it was celebrated or anything like that. But my sense was that it was a reality in the community because most people in the colony were people of African descent, at least partially. And some of the fewest Europeans to come in the 19th century, people who would come to a colony that had just ended slavery, very bad financial decision, were often Jewish people from Europe who had a completely different sense of leaving Europe and never going back. Most of those colonies is like a European came, made a lot of money, went back, this and that. The Jewish people of Suriname in general didn't really return until their descendants did before the Holocaust. Sure, go ahead.
Is there any indication that there was any kind of even like unofficial conversion going on with especially with the women who were
Yeah.
into Jewish family?
There were definitely. Oh yeah. So the question was, what did conversion look like? Was there were there informal conversions or not? I think that people were converted. Like, for example, we only have certain types of evidence. So, for example, we have like prayer books or rabbis' handbooks that were published for Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities in the Atlantic world. And in the back of that prayer book are the blessings for converting an enslaved person. You have an obligation if a person that you own, if you're a Jewish person and you own another person, and that person comes to you and says, I would want to be a Jew. I want to be, I want to observe the commandments as a Jew would. I want to convert to Judaism. If that person is sincere, then you're obligated, under Jewish law at least, to convert that person and free them. Now, this was, of course, a really good way to undermine the colony in the era of slavery. But some people did do it. But by and large, one of the questions that was asked by the scholar Jonathan Schorsch asked your very question, which is, did the Jews practice slavery in a different way than Christians in the Caribbean? Like, this is a question that even, I'm sure, many Southern Jewish communities ask, was there a Jewish way of holding people in bondage? And Jonathan Schorsch, according to records in Suriname, found really pretty firmly that the vast majority of Jews had no regard for Jewish law in handling people that were enslaved. But there were particular instances here and there where, for some reason or another, a woman that had given birth to a child that was fathered by a member of the male plantocracy was given a place under Jewish law in the Jewish community. It's in many ways shrouded in mystery. I mean, as you know, this is not a time of great record keeping, and it's also one of the hottest and humidest places on earth. So you have you have marriage contracts, and what you see is that some men marry women with Afro-Creole names. And you can infer from that if that woman is on the Kasuva, described as, a virgin, which she is not, there was some indication that that person was considered a member of the Jewish community. So you can't write a Kasuva with a non-Jewish spouse. So there are, or maybe they did, but it's really a question of ambiguity, I think. Yeah. Go ahead. No.
So your answer begs another question, and that is, I know in India, many Indians converted to Islam because Islam doesn't believe in caste. And so to get out of the caste system, they would become socialists. Why wouldn't more of the Creole, the African Creoles, then convert? Were they unaware of it? Was it not? Has anybody researched?
Meaning in the era of slavery or after slavery?
To get out of slavery.
Oh, yeah.
To get out of slavery.
I think that it was no, because the Jewish community was treated by the colonial authorities as a world unto itself. In some ways, the Surinamese Jewish community functioned on sort of quasi-medieval independence. So like the idea in Frankfurt was that you locked the gates at night of the Jewish ghetto. And like on one hand, that was oppressive, but on the other hand, the Jews had their space and their governance and their sense of community and so forth. In the Jewish community in Suriname in the era of slavery, it was not considered advantageous for anyone, including the European Jewish plantocracy, to have their slaves converting to Judaism. I think that it was just indicative of the enormous pull of sexual violence, and also the fact that there was a larger proportion of Jews, that some Jewish people in the era of slavery had close enough social contacts with people of African descent who were enslaved that the borders between the Jewish community and those people dissolved in particular cases. But the vast majority of people who were enslaved by Jews were not ever welcomed into the Jewish community, even as second-class Jews. They were just owned. They were just enslaved. And they knew about Shabbos and what kashrus was and so forth. but there wasn't a sense of that intimacy and membership in the community that a few people in the era of slavery were able to attain. Yeah.
We have a question from Zoom.
Sure.
Are there instances in Suriname, as Laura Lehman found, where Afro-Caribbean Jews passed into the white Jewish community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, yes, I mean, Suriname was perceived in the Atlantic world as a place that was more open to the idea of a darker skinned person being part of the Jewish community in the fullest sense. So yes, in this, I think though that it's a little harder because Laura Liebman is talking about people who were people of color who then moved to New York and were able to shift into white identity as a result of the different sense of racial identity that existed in the United States. I think that over time, especially in the period time that Laura Liebman is talking about in the middle of the 19th century, the Jewish community in Suriname consisted of people, for the most part, who were brown-skinned, who would not be identified in the United States as white, or were very maybe light-skinned people of African descent. For some reason in the United States, by virtue of where they lived or who their family members were able to be accepted as white in America. The same kind of structure of racial identity and typology of racial identity didn't hold in Suriname in the same way. I hope that answers that question. But Laura Liebman is talking about a Caribbean Jewish woman of color who, when she moved from Barbados to New York, was able to live in a white world. And maybe she was darker than other people, but she was part of white society, white Jewish society. It's not so much a person in the Caribbean being understood as a white member of the Jewish community.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
Thank you. Aleichem shalom. Thank you.
All right. And I hope to see many of you on Monday night for film night.
Cool.